One of these puppies is named Enzo, and will later take over the role of Eddie from Moose when he retires. Hello, and welcome to the 26th installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at our first episode of 2024. Happy New Year, everyone! This week's episode is called The Unkindest Cut of All, and is the second episode of Season 2. This title is a reference to the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar. This isn't our first Shakespeare reference, and I highly doubt it will be our last, as Shakespeare tends to fit quite nicely with the crane's taste. The Unkindest Cut of All scored 20.6 million viewers, which is basically flat from last week's 20.7 million. A nice hold from the Season 2 opener, and a good bit of consistency. For the same week, the second James Burrows directed episode of Friends fell below Frasier, bringing in 20.2 million viewers, a difference of well under 500,000 viewers. On the Seinfeld front, the ratings weren't even close. Seinfeld also remained nearly flat, but it pulled in 32.4 million viewers, beating both shows by around 12 million viewers. It is interesting that Seinfeld picked up so much momentum coming back from the summer break, whereas Frasier has dropped to a new, lower level. This episode originally aired on September 27th, 1994, and had production code number 201. Which means this episode was originally planned as the season opener, before getting switched with last week's episode for whatever reason. I personally would have preferred this episode air as a season opener, as it's a little more fun than the last one, but it is what it is. The Unkindest Cut of All is a Rick Barron directed episode. We last saw Barron on direction in the 20th episode of the first season. This is the last episode the technical coordinator will direct, and an all-around stronger outing than his previous effort. I believe this is in part thanks to the script this week from first-time Frasier scribe Dave Hackle, and his first and only writing spot for the series. Hackle is a guy I'm kind of surprised didn't write a few more episodes of Frasier, given his credits. In the very late 70s and all of the 80s, Hackle worked primarily as a producer. He did long stints on Dear John, Webster, and Sanchez of Bel Air. In the 90s, he moved into creative consulting after doing a single episode of creative consulting for Harper Valley PTA. He did creative consulting for a season of Wings, 10 episodes of Almost Perfect, and he'll ultimately consult for 55 episodes of Frasier, which covers most of seasons 3 through 5. He would leave Frasier in 1998 when he became a showrunner for his own television series, the Ted Danson comedy, Becker, which ran for 129 episodes. He'd retired from television work shortly after this, and since then has written some columns for the Huffington Post. Our episode starts out with the return of our old favorite intro, the blinking light on top of the Space Needle. This marks the 8th appearance of this introduction, pulling it ahead of the elevator and the Space Needle, after tying them up at the end of Season 1. Our first guest star of the week arrives shortly into our opening scene, with Jodie Winters' Mrs. Greenwood. Winters is a "that girl who was in that thing" actress, who has been regularly active since the 60s. She's appeared in The Brady Bunch, Dirty Harry, The $6 Million Man, Soap, The Munsters Today, Murder, She Wrote, and ER. The only starring role she had in television was the poorly received one-season spinoff of All in the Family, Gloria. In addition to her television and film appearances, she's done a few roles on stage, including playing Nurse Ratched in a European production of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. She also played Marie Antoinette in a radio drama production of Bastille for the University of Chicago. She passed in 2016 at the age of 94. This marks her first and only appearance on Frasier. Mrs. Greenwood arrived to accuse Eddie of being an illegitimate father, which, in her defense, he most certainly is. and she hands off a box of Eddie's puppies to Frasier. The sheer look of horror on Grammer's face as he accepts the box of puppies is one of the highlights of this episode, and Grammer hamming it up at his best. There's a joke about the puppies staring at Frasier, since they're taking after their father. The only thing is, only 3 out of 4 of the puppies are actually staring. The other one's looking the other way. Given how much energy and just how rambunctious puppies are, I think it's impressive the cast and crew was able to get these ones to behave as well as they did. And I'm not the only one who thought so. I'm not saying this is the reason why, but I think it's interesting to note that this episode was nominated for Outstanding Direction in Comedy by the Directors Guild of America. Frasier actually did end up winning this award, but it was won for next week's episode as opposed to this one. Which makes me very curious what David Lee's The Matchmaker will bring us next week. This brings us into the studio with Frasier trying to paw a puppy off on Roz, and gives us the biggest contradiction in the episode. He asks her if she knows anyone who would want 6 puppies. Yet, when we saw the puppies in the opening scene, it is very clear there are only 4 in the box. I'm not sure why this line of dialogue was used instead of just saying 4 puppies. It would have flowed exactly the same and would have been true to what we just seen on the screen. Interestingly of note, some of these puppies are actually Moose's real-life children. And adding a bit of interesting irony to Frasier proclaiming they're little Eddies, one of these puppies is named Enzo, and will later take over the role of Eddie from Moose when he retires. Granted, they couldn't have possibly known this at the time of the production, but I found it really interesting nonetheless. Roz had me going for just a minute in this episode when she's adoring the puppies, only to shove it back at Frasier and tell him she's more of a cat woman. After Roz rejects the puppy offered by Frasier, we get our guest caller this week, and that's Lily Tomlin. Tomlin has done a little bit of everything. She's been an actress, a singer, a comedian, and a producer. She started her career out as a stand-up comedian before slowly making the transition to on-screen, with her debut role and uncredited voice appearance on Scarecrow of the Garden of Cucumber. From there, she'd go on to appear as a regular in 79 episodes of Laugh-In, The Late Show, 9 to 5, and land a recurring role on Sesame Street. In the mid-90s, she found success as the voice of Miss Frizzle on The Magic School Bus, and a recurring role on Murphy Brown. She's continued to act to the current day with regular parts on The West Wing, Grace and Frankie, and the Spider-Verse movies, where she voices Aunt May. Over her career, she's won 7 Emmys, a Tony, and a Grammy for one of her comedy albums. The guest caller wraps up with what might be the most obvious joke in the series thus far, with Frasier offering Tomlin's character a dog to help with her loneliness. Sometimes the obvious jokes work, and they're obvious for a reason. This one is right on that fine line between it working in the context of this episode and being a bit too obvious. I can't imagine Frasier saying anything else, but I'm also not sure how well it actually landed as the final line of the scene. We get an all-French title card here, which translates to a bit of pâté behind the ears. The interesting thing about this, and the fact that Niles will spread just that, a little bit of pâté behind his ears in the very next scene, is this was actually done pretty commonly by our cast here, to encourage Eddie to nuzzle them when the script called for it. At the start of our next scene, we find Daphne rejecting applicants for the puppies, and her hair looks really different here. This is the first time we've ever seen her hair like this. In prior episodes, it's always been down around her shoulders or in a loose ponytail. Going forward, Daphne is going to be changing her hair up quite a bit. It'll be interesting to see what different hairstyles she tries out. The applicant who Daphne doesn't want to give the final puppy to is Mr. Thomas, played by Joel Anderson. Anderson is a minor, that guy who was in that thing actor, who kept himself pretty busy throughout the 90s and early 2000s. He appeared in an episode of Cheers, where he played a baseball player. He's also had small spots in NYPD Blue, Seventh Heaven, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and Malcolm in the Middle. Post-2008, he has appeared in one short, but has otherwise retired from acting. we get to see the effects of Niles putting the pate behind his ears, and it's a joy to see Niles actually getting licked by a dog. Given just how germophobic Niles has been in the past, you'd expect him to be like Lucy on Charlie Brown and yell for disinfectant. Granted, the only reason he's not doing that is because he's trying to impress Daphne, but it doesn't change the hilariousness and ridiculousness of the scene. Niles' horror is then on full display when Eddie starts licking him, and it is exactly the kind of behavior you'd expect out of Niles. It's also more great hammy acting from one of our Crane brothers. Niles and Frasier decide that he needs to be fixed, and that Martin isn't going to be the one to do it. They have most of a conversation in French, as they're afraid Eddie will understand what they're saying if they do it in English. The translation of their scene here is, Niles, you turn right. Frasier, oh, good, good. I will walk up behind him. Niles, but you're the one who's got to take him to the doctor for the snip snip. Frasier, ah, that's true, but... And at that point, Frasier proclaims this is ridiculous and switches back to English. It's about what I'd assumed they were saying, and I think it's interesting they didn't just hardcode subtitles in for that conversation. While Martin and Frasier get into a totally understandable fight, Eddie escapes from the vet and runs away. This leads to Martin offering a $500 reward for anyone who can find Eddie, which Frasier thinks is ridiculous. Even today, a $500 reward for finding a dog isn't a small amount. But as a dog owner, I totally understand, and it would be worth every last penny. Interestingly, $500 adjusted for inflation is a little over $1,000 today. A very hefty amount for the reward, and a very understandable reason for why Frasier is shocked at the amount, even if he secretly likes Eddie. All of this results in a stakeout at the park, while the Crane family looks for Eddie. Niles is ridiculous and lost in the woods. He actually has to call Frasier and Martin with his cell phone to find his way back to the car. This is the first time in the series we get a look at Frasier's car phone. It's not a great look, but it's enough for us to get a pretty good idea what it is. It's obviously a bag phone, which were actually in production from 1988 all the way until the year 2000. It's got the screen on the back of the handset and the answer/hang-up buttons right under the display. This means it has to be a Nokia phone of some sort, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to pinpoint the exact model. I believe it is part of the C line, but beyond that, it's a bit of a mystery. You can find pretty extensive historical details on handheld phones from the 90s, but when it comes to bag phones, the history doesn't seem to have been well recorded. Without knowing the exact model, it's impossible to say what the price point was, but other bag phones in the era were sold between $1,500 and $3,000 installed. We also get another look at Frasier's car this episode. This is the first time we've really seen it since the Christmas episode, when it was parked outside the restaurant he went to on Christmas Day. We actually got a better look at it during that episode, but I didn't take a look at it then. Neither of these episodes give us a really great shot of it, but we are able to tell that it's a BMW E34 Series 5 sedan. This body style was made for model years 1989 to 1995, and had both a regular and supercharged diesel version. This was the first generation of the Series 5 BMW to feature both all-wheel drive and a V8 version. There were production plants in both Germany and South Africa during the 7 model years the E4 was in production. A little more than 1.3 billion were produced. Interestingly, the base model was only available in Europe, although I'm sure Frasier would never have sprung for something so pedestrian, even if it was available in the US. As the episode winds down, we get a nice father and son moment between Martin and Frasier. We also get Martin telling Frasier about all the different nicknames they had for other cops when he was on the force. I really like this tidbit of dialogue. We haven't got that many references to Martin's time on the force, and whenever we do, it feels like a great look into his life, and this is no exception. Before Eddie reappears by jumping on the back of the car, which Frasier spots through the rearview mirror, with some wonderful eye acting from him. This episode has the perfect coda, with all 3 Crane males taking Eddie to the vet to finally get fixed, and having just the perfect reaction. Exactly in unison when the nurse leads Eddie away for his operation. It's funny, clever, and the perfect ending note for this episode. One other note of interest, this episode actually aired on the 10th anniversary of Frasier Crane's first appearance on Cheers. There's nothing really of significance in this episode to reference this, and considering the switching around of the production codes, I'm not sure they even knew it would air on the anniversary during the writing of it. But there's a cool bit of history, nonetheless. There's one minor goof in this episode that is really easy to disregard, and that's the ringing of a studio phone in the background around the 7-minute and 42-second mark. I can't really show you without playing audio, and playing audio definitely triggers the copyright warnings, so you'll have to check it out for yourself. It's pretty quiet, and you can easily pretend it's just a phone ringing in one of Frasier's neighbors' apartments, if you want an explanation for it. On the tie front, we have 2 repeats for Frasier, with the Thanksgiving tie making its 5th appearance, after last showing up way back in episode 16, and this red and gray tie making its 2nd appearance, after first appearing in the season 1 finale. Niles has the 4th appearance of his red waffle pattern tie. He last wore this in episode 19. He's also sporting a new tie during the coda scene. This tie is really similar to a lot of the modern art looking ties he's worn before with the abstract designs, but it's got a lot more red than any version he's had on in the past. This is Niles' first new tie of season 2, and leaves him 1 tie shy of Frasier's total at 28 to 29 ties. This was the episode that was originally meant to be the premiere of season 2, and even though it ultimately doesn't matter, I feel this would have been a stronger opening. It has actual lasting consequences for Eddie, and some nice emotional beats for both Frasier and Martin, as well as a masterful coda scene. We also got some nice alternative hair for both Niles and Daphne, who we get to flesh out as very protective of puppies, and get to see her being sassy with Frasier again. This is the side of Daphne I like best, and I'm hoping going into this season we're going to get to see a lot more of it. As with a lot of episodes centered outside the studio, we don't get a lot of Roz here, but that's fine because she's not the star of this episode. In fact, despite his lack of screen time, there's no doubt that the true star this week is Moose and his children. The puppies absolutely steal the show, and are adorable and shockingly well behaved for puppies. Eddie just running away from the vet because Martin accidentally left the door open is a little silly, but otherwise this is a very well written episode, and one can easily see why it was nominated by the Directors Guild of America. This would have been a great way to start season 2, and even as a second episode, it's a really good time. Even if you're a cat woman, or man, settle in and give this 8 out of 10 episode of Frasier a watch.